is that the world system is inherently exploitative. The second characteristic is that the global economy is actually global. It's not just about Europe any longer. Through colonial expansion, it now becomes truly global. And for world systems theory people, it's a structural theory. By which I mean they say, look, it's not the fault of individuals. Monopoly capitalists are not inherently bad people. It's just that the structure of global capitalism makes them do it. Right? It's like, I didn't mean to do it, but the pressures of global capital makes me need to expand. I don't want to expand, I don't mean to be exploitative, but the logic of capitalism forces me, structurally, to expand. So for world systems theory people, it's not that people are evil or good, it's the world system simply works this way. And really, the key writing on world systems theory is a fellow by the name of Emanuel Wallerstein, who in the context of Latin America develops this theory called, or this school of thought called, the dependency school. So world systems theory and dependency are oftentimes thought of together. The dependency school basically takes a systematic or systemic view of global capitalism. It's by thinking about dependency that we begin to actually come up with terms like first world and third world. Right? Before that, if you're in Europe in the 17th century, global really is just Europe. The rest of the world, the rest of the globe are just barbarians. Okay, but we begin to actually see now under dependency school a truly sense of global capitalism. The second characteristic of dependency, or the dependency school, is that it presumes a liberal ideological hegemony. It basically presumes that Adam Smithian notions of free trade are the dominant paradigm. And in many ways, one could arguably say that that's empirically true, right? I mean, at the time, if you think about who were the two leading hegemons over the last 150 years, it's England and the United States. And both of them were free traders. They wanted a neoliberal global capitalist system. Those in the dependency school also believed that capitalism creates what are called monopolistic producers. Dependency school adherents, they really take umbrage with Adam Smith and saying, let's not be naive here, right? The global capitalist system isn't about a bunch of individual, weavers making textiles, and filling their small orders, and some little winemaker in Portugal making small batches of wine. No, the reality is that global capitalism is about monopolistic producers. It's about conglomerates. It's about huge firms like the English East India Trading Company or Walmart today. They also argue, and this is important, that whereas global capitalism is about monopolistic producers, global capitalism is also about monopsonistic purchasers. So monopolistic producers means that you basically have a monopoly on the production of a good, right? That's why you have these massive firms. Monopsonistic is basically the other side of the equation, saying that you have these massive buyers. So monopolistic producers are able to set the price because, they have a monopoly. Well, monopsony basically means you have a monopoly on the purchase. And what that effectively means then is that you get to set the price. Let me give it to you in an example. Many of these third world countries in Asia, Latin America, Africa, They sell commodities, rubber, tin, coffee, right? And who do they sell to? They don't sell to the little markets in the village. They, by and large, don't sell to little coffee shops in New York City or Toronto. They sell to first world purchasers. And these purchasers are huge firms. And because they can only sell to that one huge firm, that firm tells them the price that they are willing to pay. So if you go back to that Walmart clip we saw last week, remember when they were talking about Walmart going to its suppliers, and they go in a room, and all these suppliers would sit there and say, oh, we'll make your toothbrush for, $1, or we'll make it for... Because Walmart is such a powerful purchaser, it can basically set the price. It'll basically say, no, you're too expensive. We want you to take down your price by another penny, and because they control the purchasing, they control the price. The last thing that dependency school theorists presume is this colonial legacy. Basically, their argument here is that these poor countries in the third world, these colonies, when those colonial governments left, they were left with nothing. They were left economically underdeveloped. They were left with very little infrastructure. Because they were effectively slave labor, they were left with very little skills. They were left with very little capacity for transformation. In other words, these post-colonial countries in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America had very little prospects of development. And this is what Lenin then means by the violence of imperialism. You're doing violence on a society by effectively exploiting it and then leaving it with very little with which to develop subsequently. So for dependency school theorists then, it really is about the structure of global capitalism. For students of dependency theory, they don't believe, well, some do, but the theory is that it's not that individuals are evil. It's not that capitalists are evil. But rather it's that the international system requires the expansion of capital, requires you to purchase things at cheaper prices, requires you to exploit labor in other countries, because that's how the global capitalist system works. So for dependency school theorists then, because this is a structural theory, it's not about individuals, it's not even about good and evil, although some would say it is. But fundamentally for dependency school theorists, there are basically two types of countries. There are those countries that are in the core, and there are those countries that are in the periphery. And this isn't a geographical designation. The countries in the core are rich first world countries. They're the ones with industry. They're the ones with global finance capital. Those are the countries that buy coffee as monopolistic purchasers. The countries in the periphery are all those poor countries supplying to the core. We don't grow bananas. We buy them from the periphery. We don't grow coffee. We buy that from the periphery. We don't have rubber plantations. We buy that from the periphery. We don't need to mill or mine tin. We buy that from the periphery. What this then leads to is a structural dependency. Countries in the periphery are structurally dependent on those countries in the core. Right? If you're a country in the periphery, you're in tropical Southeast Asia, you have a lot of bananas. Well, you can't, as a country, survive on bananas. You gotta sell those bananas. And you gotta sell them to first world markets. And first world markets will determine the price for you. So if you are Malaysia, you are structurally dependent on the core. If you're in the periphery, you tend to export low-value mono-agricultural goods, meaning single goods, at fixed prices that are determined by the core. And you are dependent, therefore, on what we call the global north. So we have three theories now. We have the Adam Smithian view of the world, that as long as individuals behave rationally and let markets rule, then we will have mutual prosperity, maximal efficient productivity, and global peace. For Adam Smith, it's a positive-sum world. The mercantilists say, no, it's not about individuals, it's about countries. And what Adam Smith is describing is, in fact, a very inherently unfair world. And therefore, that we need the visible hand of government to distort the market for these countries to grow. For the Leninists, who then inspired dependency school theorists, the structure of global capitalism is inherently exploitative and divides the world up into countries of the core and countries of the periphery. Again, as a theory then, world systems theory and dependency school theory explains how the world works. It predicts that there is very little possibility of change for those in the third world. And in many ways, it prescribes a third world united revolution. So then how do we make sense of all this theory? Well, first of all, I think we all have to agree, regardless if you're a Smithian or a Listian or a Leninist, we all have to agree that we live in a global capitalist system. All three of these theorists, Smith, List, and Lenin, agree we live in a global capitalist system. But each of these theories has a different take. The Adam Smiths of the world say you should embrace global capitalism. The mercantilists of the world say you should manipulate global capitalism. And the Leninists of the world say you should reject global capitalism. You can think about it in a different way in terms of dominance. For the cosmopolitical view, or from the cosmopolitical viewpoint, it's not about dominance at all. It's a positive-sum universal good. That individual liberalism determines your own destiny. So as long as you are rational, as long as you do what you're good at, and as long as you work hard, then you will prosper. The mercantilist view is more about preventing dominance. That it's a negative-sum world, but that nations can create comparative advantage in dynamic change. That if you're smart about it, you can prevent dominance. And for the Marxist-Leninists, it has to be about dominance. For Marxist-Leninists, the global capitalist system is inherently exploitative. It is inherently negative-sum. And there is inherently no way out of this system. Now, this is in many ways a very stylized way of understanding these three contending viewpoints, but when you think about it, these three viewpoints are the ways in which we understand the global economy. I will let you decide what you think about the global economy and which of these three theories you adhere to. But before we move on, I do want to stress that the world systems theory carries with it great appeal. And it doesn't carry with it great appeal just simply because of the orators that tend to deliver and that tend to talk about world systems theory. But world systems theory is very appealing because in many ways it helps us explain variation. It helps us explain why some countries are poor and some countries remain rich. On one level, world systems systems theory is very appealing because of the post-colonial moment. One has to remember that world systems theory really emerges in the 1950s and 1960s. It emerges from writers and thinkers from out of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And world systems theory emerges in a post-colonial moment when much of the world says, look, you know, these colonies have basically been screwed for 100 years. It's not their fault that they are poor. If anything, it's the fault of the colonizers that they are poor. That these countries, in fact, are victims of capitalist expansion. That these poor souls in the third world, in this post-colonial moment, are not bad people making bad decisions, but rather they are victims of global capitalism. So there's a certain sympathy that emerges in the post-colonial moment that aligns people's views with world system theory. World systems theory is also appealing, quite frankly, because, look, it's a fact. There are lots of poor countries in the world. And that over the last 50 years, these poor countries have not gotten richer, and in fact, the richer countries have gotten richer. If you look at, for instance, economic growth rates from 1960 to 1995, rich countries grew at an average rate of 2.5% a year. Middle-income countries grew at a percentage of 1.8% per year. Poor countries grew on average 1.1% per year. So between 1960 and 1995, rich countries grew at a faster rate than poor countries. Rich countries became richer, and poor countries tended to stay poor. So world systems theory naturally is appealing because in many ways it explains empirical reality. World systems theory was also appealing because one has to remember of the appeal, or at least to some people, the appeal at the time of the Soviet alternative. There was a Marxist alternative during the 1950s and 1960s. I remember this was the era of the hippie. This was the hippie era, right? This was when you could teach a class on Chinese politics in the 1960s and students would leave the room if you didn't pay proper homage to Mao. Right? This was a different time. And it was a time when the Soviet alternative and this notion of a third world united and this notion of a self-reliance of the third world was extremely appealing. In part because these countries were poor, in part because of the empathy and sympathy that comes out of the post-colonial moment, but also because it seemed to be a logical alternative. And we know that in the 1950s and 1960s in the post-colonial world, communism was very appealing in the third world. Marxist-Leninism was very appealing in African countries such as Ghana. It was very appealing in South Asian countries such as India, which only opened up its economy in 1991. Prior to that, it held to a very state socialist regime. We know that also that Marxist-Leninism was very appealing in many parts of Latin America, Cuba, Chile before 1973, and so on. So the idea of the Soviet alternative was a very real one and was very much in line with the appeal of world systems theory. The key point I want to make here then was that development, because of world systems theory, development became a global project. And the Bronx Commission, which I reference here, came out with a report in 1980 called North and South. And basically the argument in the Bronx Commission was that the global South had been screwed by colonialism, and that it was the moral responsibility of those countries of the global North, or the core, to transfer resources to the poor countries of the global South. It was in this era that we begin to see things like development assistance, foreign aid, reparations paid post-colonialism, subsidies and credits for those countries in the third world, debt reparations and debt cancellations, and so on. The point here is that world systems theory was extremely politically attractive. It seemed like the way in which we could even the playing field. However, the fact of the matter is, regardless and notwithstanding the appeal of world systems theory, the fact of the matter is, poor countries stay poor. World systems theory was very appealing. Those on the left, you know, this was their thing, right? This was extremely attractive. It was about sticking it to the core countries. It was about, you know, dismantling monopoly capitalism. It was about making the world more fair, and so on. But the fact of the matter is, the poor stayed poor. Then something curious happened. Most of the developing world through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s stayed poor. As I just said, the average growth rate in low-income countries was 1.1%. But something curious happens. While the rest of the developing world stays poor, you have this group of economies here experiencing extremely rapid aggregate economic growth. Between 1965 and 1980, this period of high growth, the average annual growth rate in Taiwan, 9.8%. South Korea, 9.6%. Singapore, 10.1%. Malaysia, remember Malaysia, the place that just sold rubber and bananas? 7.3%. I can assure you they didn't get rich selling rubber and bananas. Thailand grows at 7.2%. So Latin America at this time is experiencing negative growth. Africa is experiencing zero growth, and for some reason, these economies, there's something curious that happens, is experiencing extremely rapid growth. Now I want to stress, this is an extremely curious phenomenon because these economies, in the post-war period, in the early 1950s, were extremely poor. It is famously noted that GDP per capita in Korea in 1950 was lower than the average of Africa. Korea, which now makes probably almost everything you're using, in 1950 was poorer than the average in Africa. These economies registered extremely low on all social indicators, literacy, health, income, etc. These economies were not export-oriented economies. They didn't make anything that the rest of the world wanted to buy. They were largely agricultural economies. They were post-colonial economies. They were and had been the victims of Japanese colonialism and Japanese expansionism throughout the 1930s. They had no industry to speak of. But then they became these miracle economies, growing at near 10% per year over the course of the 1960s, 70s, and well into the 1980s, which then leads to actually a very famous book written by the World Bank in 1993 called The East Asian Miracle. So the rest of the developing world is experiencing low growth and no growth, and the East Asian economic miracle is registering very high growth. Just to give you some sense as to how rich these economies have become and how quickly, we look at GNP per capita. These are adjusted values of US dollars. GNP per capita in Japan, 1,940, by 1995 is $40,000. In Japan, we see an increase of 20 times over the course of 25 years. In Singapore, GNP per capita increases 26 times in the course of one generation. In Taiwan, 30 times. In South Korea, 30 times. Until very recently, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. Singapore is the richest economy in all of Asia by purchasing power parity. Taiwan is the second richest economy in all of Asia by purchasing power parity. And Korea, since the 1990s, has been an OECD country, making it a member of the world's club of rich nations. Again, these economies, with the exception of Japan, were poorer, or at least in Korea, which was emblematic, were poorer than the national average in Africa. So how do we explain this then? What are some of the characteristics of the East Asian mirror? The first, obviously, is that they experienced extraordinarily rapid economic growth. They experienced all the traits of what we call economic modernization. I also want to stress, not only did these economies grow at near 10% a year, but they grew with relatively egalitarian distributions of income. So they're growing at about 10% a year, but if you look actually at the distribution of income data, the distribution of income in places like Taiwan and Korea were actually very similar to places like Norway, Sweden, and Finland. So these economies were growing extremely rapidly, but the benefits of this aggregate economic growth was actually relatively, or shared relatively equitably across society. These economies not only grew with relative equity, but they also engaged in industrial upgrading. They began in the 1950s simply selling agricultural products. Then in the 1960s, they began to manufacture toys and so on. Then they moved into electronics, and then they moved into IT, and they moved into further capital-intensive industries. So over the course of 30 or 40 years, they moved from what we call labor-intensive, right? Factory work, labor-intensive manufacturing, to really high value-add, capital-intensive, high-tech industry. Over the course of, again, 30, 40 years. They also engaged in export-led economic development. All of these countries basically have very small domestic markets. They're not big countries. Korea has a population of 45 million, Taiwan 25 million. These are all small economies. They can't just sell things to their own population. They need to sell things on global markets. And so they engaged in export-led economic growth. They plugged into the global economy. And they made things that the global market wanted to buy. Just to give you one sense, right? Remember, world systems theory says that these countries on the periphery are locked in. And their prescription basically is to reject the global capitalist system. But we actually see here that economic growth closely mirrors plugging into the global economy. Here's just an example. In the case of South Korea, you can see in the 1950s it was still relatively poor. Less than 10% of its GNP was attributed to foreign trade. By the 1980s, of course, this is now more than two-thirds. Two-thirds of Korea's national product in the 1980s was gained through foreign trade. As you can see there, between 63 and 84, Korea had a positive trade balance, with the exception of 2 years. That means they sold more than they bought. The point here is that if you wanted your economy to grow, or at least these mirror-built economies, you had to plug into the global market. Now, how do we explain this? How do we explain East Asia's economic rise when the rest of the developing world is staying poor? World systems theory, in many ways, can't explain it. World systems theory in the dependency school would tell you that those countries would remain on the periphery, that they would and should remain forever poor. All right, then how do we explain it? Actually, before we go, any questions or clarification before we continue?